This place is meant to be in charge. But with 5 prime ministers in 6 years, it hasn't felt that way.
The whole Operation Number 10 was utterly broken down.
What's the answer?
We became a laughingstock of the world.
An utter catastrophic disaster.
In this series, we're trying to work out what happened to our political system.
I think we lost our minds. I don't know a single MP who didn't get a death threat.
The party that likes to believe it's born to rule has indulged in an epic drama with no lasting heroes.
I have been a systematic plotter who's tried to remove the Prime Minister.
You are not children in the playground, you are legislators.
I'm Laura Kuenssberg, and I was the BBC's political editor for nearly 7 years. It was my job to make sense of what on earth was going on, or at least to try, as we all lived through a norm-busting, convention-defying moment of history.
Was Liz Truss a good Prime Minister?
She could have been a good Prime Minister.
No, I'm really certain about that one.
In this episode, peak chaos, as 2 prime ministers are toppled in just 15 weeks.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
First, it's over Boris Johnson's relationship with the truth.
Should we cancel Christmas parties?
I knew that someone at Number 10 has been lying again.
Then, Liz Truss takes on the establishment.
I get things done in government, and I don't just talk, I act.
And wreaks economic and political havoc.
I said to her, we can't go helter-skelter. We've got to slow things down.
Months in the making, working with insiders who've never spoken publicly before, we go behind the scenes to Westminster's real cast list. The civil servants, the ministers, and the political advisors now free to speak.
Cautiousness, even boringness, all of that looked as though it was gone.
Just how close did our political system come to falling apart? And will it ever be the same again?
It is the end of normal.
Of explosions in the Ukrainian capital as Vladimir Putin announces a special military operation in
Good morning from Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, a city, a country under fire.
All the advice was that, at best, Zelensky had probably 2 weeks, maybe 3 days. Boris was the first leader in NATO to say, no, we've got to help.
Conflict in the Ukraine played to Boris's greatest strengths. President Zelensky needed someone in the West with the authority and the credibility that comes from being a G7 economy, a member of the Security Council of the United Nations. And in Boris, he not only found somebody who became a very, very close confidant and a very intimate confidant, but the best cheerleader he could have had.
How are you?
You know
How are you?
Boris Johnson, a leader more interested in the grand sweep of ideas than pulling levers in Whitehall. He seized this moment to walk on the world stage, but he couldn't use it to shake off what was going on back home.
It was mad. You know, the week when things went sour was arguably the best week of his leadership, where he'd been to the G7 summit, dominating the debate, bringing allies together, sense of purpose on the Ukraine immense, and then he flies back and some drunken MP has behaved appallingly and everything comes crashing down.
Allegations emerged that Boris Johnson's deputy chief whip and ally, Chris Pincher, had groped 2 men. He quit his job in government, but the Prime Minister didn't kick him out as an MP. There was a clamour to know how far Boris Johnson would go to protect his coterie. How much did he even care about bad behaviour?
What is it about Boris Johnson that actually he seems to actively, tolerate mistakes and what appears to be bad behaviour by other people around him?
I don't know. I mean, he's obviously not keen on sacking people, is he, Boris Johnson? I mean, he didn't
to sack Chris Pincher when he got the opportunity. And his calculation is often, I'm only really going to sack someone if they are costing me.
I think he's very trusting, and sometimes he's too trusting. And he's very loyal, and sometimes he's too loyal. And he's also kind, and sometimes too kind. But I think for many of us, that's why we like him.
In summer 2019, the civil servant in charge at the Foreign Office, where Pincher then worked, was approached about his behaviour.
And you did then open a formal investigation. So can you tell us about that? Take us inside what happened.
A group of colleagues coming to complain about a minister's behaviour is unusual. I would say unique in my time as a permanent secretary. So it was a memorable meeting. The story that they told was compelling. So I immediately got in touch with the propriety and ethics team in the Cabinet Office, and they helped us run an investigation.
So you did at that point open a formal investigation to be crystal clear about what's happened?
There was a formal investigation into Chris Pincher's behaviour, yes. I engaged at a senior level, and that senior level briefed the Prime Minister.
I was in the room when Boris asked Chris Pincher to come back into the Whip's office. He took the job. Civil servants who, in any reshuffle, are then charged with checking whether there's any reason that person cannot be appointed, gave the green light for that appointment to go ahead. So in a scenario like that, I think a Prime Minister is entitled to feel that due process has been followed. If your civil servants in charge of propriety and ethics say there's no objection to appointing him, then that's it.
When you heard the government say there'd never been any red flags about his behaviour, what did you think?
I knew that was not true. And it felt to me as the days went by that the number 10 line kept developing, but in ways which were not truthful, not complete.
There are different versions in the papers this morning. The Mail on Sunday, which has a quote, it said, Boris Johnson said to his aides in 2020, he's handsy, that's a problem, Pincher by name, Pincher by nature. Did you ask about that specific quote? It's on the front pages of the papers today.
No, I didn't. I've been at another news studio before coming here today.
The final straw for me was watching Therese Coffey, and she was clearly feeling the strain of having to trot out lines that she had been instructed to use. And they were lies.
Did the Prime Minister know that there were allegations of sexual misconduct against Chris Pincher when he appointed him as Deputy Chief Whip?
To the best of my understanding, the Prime Minister has not been aware of specific allegations against Chris Pincher. As people will know...
So I got in touch with the Foreign Office, the Cabinet Office, and number 10, and said, I am telling you that the lines that the government is using are wrong, misleading, deliberately misleading. You know, this is important. The truth is important.
I think that if you are standing in front of a crest, or you have that on your headed notepaper, or you are speaking from the government, it's so important that what you say is true. And if you say something accidentally or inadvertently or ill-advisedly that's not true, that it is corrected. And I do think that is the thing that we have got a bit far away from in the last few years.
On the Monday, the lines changed again, and they were still a load of rubbish.
This row goes to something absolutely fundamental. Can the country trust the Prime Minister? What was in your mind as you started to tell your story?
The facts were in my mind, and I felt I had to speak.
Lord MacDonald is on the line. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Justin.
You could have done this behind the scenes. Why have you been so public about it?
Number 10 have had 5 full days to get the story correct, and that has still not happened.
I think on the Tuesday and the day, yes, that's right, because we have a cabinet meeting on that morning, and before the cabinet meeting, this news came out from Simon MacDonald. I know Simon MacDonald, and I think he's a man of full integrity, and I knew that someone at number 10 has been lying again.
And in the last few minutes, news that the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, has just resigned with a letter to the Prime Minister, which our political correspondent Jonathan Blake...
At this point, I just thought the Prime Minister has completely changed his team at number 10. The same things are going on all over again.
Stay as they are. Jonathan, I'm just going to interrupt you. Rishi Sunak has just announced his resignation as well.
The right thing to do when you lose confidence is to be honest and go to your boss and just tell him you can't serve anymore.
The public rightly expect government to be conducted properly.
Sarge at least had the courtesy to go and see Boris and tell him face to face that he was walking out. Rishi didn't even let him know. We discovered, I think, from the news or maybe even from Twitter. I can't remember. And that, for Boris, was very offensive.
Just minutes before the Chancellor and Health Secretary resigned, Johnson had, at last, admitted he was aware of the 2019 investigation into Pincher's behaviour, saying it had been resolved back then.
Hello, Mr. Jeffrey.
But it was too late.
Good evening. I'm just going to go and spend some time with my family. Thank you.
The match had been lit on the pent-up frustration over Downing Street's attitude to the truth. The failure to come clean over Pincher revealed the burning unhappiness for all to see.
How would you describe Boris Johnson's overall attitude to the truth?
Unusual. I think, yeah, unusual.
Does he lie?
In a politician.
Does he lie?
I think that's a matter of public record.
I think he views the world through a lens of his own self-aggrandisement. And I'm not alone in this view. I speak to many people, including some who have never expressed any negative views about Boris Johnson publicly, but privately recognise somebody who is far too self-indulgent and self-focused to really do the job of a minister, let alone the job of Prime Minister.
I think he is able to absolutely believe his version of the truth, whether at the time or retrospectively, and he's able to really believe it.
So Boris Johnson can lie while also lying to himself that he's not lying.
Yeah.
How important is the truth to you, Prime Minister?
Very important, Bob.
And accuracy of language and statement?
Also.
Very important.
Very, very important.
The roots of the downfall had been planted long before the Pincher scandal, when Number 10 struggled to get its story straight over the most embarrassing allegations.
The first I heard about parties was when I saw news reports, which was in the Daily Mirror, I think. I was told, and the whole government was told, that this is all nonsense, this is rubbish, just ignore this. And I thought maybe actually I could benefit the doubt, maybe it's just the Daily Mirror exaggerating and all of that.
What I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely during...
All the guidelines were observed, continue to be observed, and what I can also tell you is that we're getting on with the job as we have been throughout.
But then, for me, things changed around the parties when I saw that video like everyone else, and from, I think, ITV got hold of this video of Allegra Stratton in a sort of mock press conference.
Would the Prime Minister condone a hanging, Chris?
What's the answer?
I don't know. I
thought, why would you ask such a question in a mock press conference unless someone in that room knew something? I was health secretary. Obviously, I was going to get asked about this video. I couldn't get answers that evening from anyone Number 10. The next day, I was told at the highest levels that they've investigated this and that there were no parties at any time, anywhere in Downing Street, no illegal gatherings, and no rules were broken at any time. I was given that assurance.
I have been repeatedly assured since these allegations emerged that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken, and that is what I have been repeatedly assured.
After weeks of defending themselves from claims of rule breaking and parties during the pandemic, the mentality inside Number 10 seemed to be more or less what it always had been. Deny, double down, brazen it out when things got rough. Boris Johnson's attitude to the truth had always been flexible, to put it mildly, and after all, he'd made it this far. So his team wondered, why would this time have to be any different?
But some who later received police fines for attending events questioned that approach.
I still don't understand why, when these stories were first mentioned, there wasn't an attempt to say, absolutely, you're right, we were all working in an entirely different world to the rest of you, and I can see that that looks extraordinary now, and we made some stupid mistakes, and we're very sorry. I don't really understand the kind of failure to do that, and it troubles me that it's all part of this kind of not actually just telling the truth and being honest about what has happened.
Do you think it is conceivable that Boris Johnson didn't know what was going on?
No, because he was at many of them. I don't think that there was an explicit, you should go nuts and do what you want to do. But I don't think there was a fear that he would be angry about it if anything was going on, in the way that I think Theresa May would have really been cross. Ultimately, a culture is set at the top. The buck does stop with the leader of the organisation. His career has been defined by having a casual approach to breaking the rules. In fact, that's generally worked for him.
But that would not wash when details of parties in Number 10 on the eve of the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral were revealed. Rules had been broken. The Queen mourned alone.
With something like the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral and the party that was taking place the night before, there was nothing to defend, and that was just disgraceful. And I think you've got to say that when these things are happening.
Was having to apologise to the Queen about those parties the night before she put her husband of over 70 years, she laid him to rest. Was that a moment of shame for you?
I deeply and bitterly regret that happened, and I can only and renew my apologies.
In January, February 2022, he still had enough goodwill to pull himself out of this deteriorating situation. And I found it very surprising that he didn't do that. He could have said, yes, I've done something wrong, I've not done everything right so far, but now we really are going to have the highest standards. Boris Johnson was not really correcting the problems in government. So that is in itself a cultural problem of not being open to the true situation, not really picking up the criticism. A tragedy, really, when Boris won such a majority and had such an ability to communicate with the country.
We have won votes and the trust of people who have never voted Conservative before. Those people want change. We cannot, must not let them down.
Boris Johnson really let it slide away through being unable to champion the highest standards of governance, which it's crucial for a Prime Minister to do.
Whatever Chris Pincher did or didn't do was overtaken by a profound anguish about Boris Johnson's whole approach. Did he care about standards of behaviour at all? Was he running a government or a scandal survival unit? Dozens of ministers ran for the door after Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak quit. Partygate had shaken the faith of the Tory party in Boris Johnson. The Pincher scandal stripped away what was left.
From Number 10 to say the Prime Minister wants to see you.
Both Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid attacked Mr Johnson's leadership and integrity, but he remained defiant, appointing Nadhim Zahawi as Chancellor.
Boris opened by saying how frustrated he was that we need to focus on economic recovery. You're an accomplished businessman. I think you can lead the Treasury and really deliver. And I said, of course, Prime Minister, it'd be a privilege to serve, and I will do my best.
Boris Johnson might have hoped the new Chancellor could steady the ship, but it was an impossible task.
Events very quickly snowballed. We were getting a resignation every half an hour.
Mr. Zahawi, forgive me interrupting you.
Yes.
But
As you were saying that sentence,
delivery. Yes.
the man who came on this programme on Monday morning to defend the Prime Minister has just resigned, Will Quince, the Education Minister, a minister in the department you left yesterday. It's over, Mr Zahawi, isn't it?
What were those last couple of days like?
He was a Prime Minister with a mandate democratically voted for by the people. And knowing what others were trying to do to thwart that mandate was quite difficult for me.
I was in regular contact with the Prime Minister amidst the drama of those last sort of 24 to 48 hours, but just making clear to Boris that he had my personal loyalty, that I felt that notwithstanding that mistakes had been made, that he was the best person to lead the party in the country, and that for as long as he chose to fight on, I would support him.
My experience of Boris during that day was he was calm, unbelievably calm. During the course of the day, we all met in one of the rooms with a whiteboard to run through various names. And then we tried to put together a government by which stage various members of the cabinet started to arrive, wanting to see the Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister asked to see each one of us individually, and I was the first to go in and see him. You know, he looked pretty tired and probably frustrated. He said, "How's it going?" I said, "Look, the work is going well." I said, "But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to say to you, look, I think we're going to struggle to form a government, and the herd is stampeding. It breaks my heart to see you go through this." He said, "Can't we fix it?" He was still in that mood to fight on.
I went to see Boris Johnson at number 10. He made it very clear that it was very stupid of people to want to lose such a successful leader who led us to a very successful general election.
By now, 39 ministers had quit. Extraordinary. A record collapse. But having made a career of surviving scandal, Johnson was still trying to dig in, even sacking his old frenemy, Michael Gove, after he'd told him to quit. Far from restoring credibility, though, it just gave him another post to fill.
One of Boris's closest allies got in contact to ask whether I would take the role of Secretary of State for Levelling Up, and I declined on the basis that I didn't really want to take on what was a huge job, my first job, heading up a government department against a backdrop of such massive uncertainty. Clearly things were moving to a denouement.
Late in number 10, a final truth was emerging that even Boris Johnson could not avoid. His time in the highest office in the land was coming to an end.
We carried on until whatever time it was. I can't quite remember what time, looking at what was left and positions to be put. And by the end of the day, it was clear for all of us that were left that we were running out of road. So Thursday morning came. I didn't sleep well at all, to be perfectly honest, and was constantly looking at Twitter to see who was next. As I'm walking to the train station, an email popped up. It was a version of a speech that Boris had written, and I think the opening lines were effectively, it's over.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you. It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister.
We just expected so much of the Parliamentary Party to forgive every indiscretion, every outburst, every breaking of convention, just, you know. And then when he needed the Parliamentary Party, he said, no, I'm sorry, we can't do this anymore.
I know that there will be many people who are relieved and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
I think people were out to undermine him, but every leader I've known, there have been people out to undermine him.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
It felt sad, yes, absolutely sad. But also it felt like perhaps there's some element of closure to this, that actually All the sort of agony and the pain of the last 2 days has ended.
Was Boris Johnson a good Prime Minister?
I think he was right for a certain stage. I don't think COVID suited his strengths. And he's set a precedent for, I think, what the public are prepared to have in their leaders.
No. It turned out that he was deeply flawed as a Prime Minister. Tragically, because he had many great qualities and could have been Prime Minister for a long time.
Boris Johnson had the mandate from the British people. And I think it has been a mistake of the Conservative Party to take away that mandate when the British people didn't.
Boris is a great campaigner. He's great at connecting with people. But that doesn't automatically translate into being a good Prime Minister. You've got to be a good chairman, you've got to read your briefs, you've got to be able to make decisions and understand that, making decisions is not just satisfying people, it's upsetting people.
Boris Johnson's always craved a place in history, and he will always have one for taking the UK out of the EU. But he'll be remembered too for a messy period in office and leaving his party unhappy, an uneasy coalition of different tribes, unsure what they had in common, split and cross. Of course, there was immediately a lineup of ambitious candidates ready to take his place. It is politics, after all. But Boris Johnson's furious rump of supporters were determined to use the influence they had left to back one candidate and block another.
Rishi had resigned to bring down Boris, and it was very unlikely, therefore, that we would want to support the person who had brought Boris Johnson down, and indeed had been campaigning against him and had set up his website some months beforehand.
I remember you and Jacob Rees-Mogg coming out of Cabinet and saying we're going to back Liz Truss.
Well, there's a reason why we did that.
So what's the reason you did that?
Well, we weren't going to back Rishi Sunak.
She's probably a stronger Brexiteer than both of us.
And she believes in low taxation.
And she's a woman. And is she the sort of continuity candidate? Will Boris Johnson be backing her?
As soon as Boris had resigned, I knew I would back Liz. The one area where I had always wished us to go further and faster was on the economy. That was never really what interested Boris. We hadn't done as much as we should to really get on with the sort of reforms which Mrs. Thatcher had delivered in the 1980s. And I was clear that among the very few upsides of the situation we now found ourselves in was that Liz could get down to work on trying to make sure that everyone gets better off from a situation where the economy just becomes high performing.
Liz Truss saw Thatcher and particularly Reagan as an inspiration for what she wanted to achieve. I think in style, perhaps Reagan was a better fit for who she wanted to be.
Boris was a phenomenal leader. I was a great fan. I still am a great fan. But I think there was a view that with the COVID and with ever-increasing taxes and ever-increasing spending, we had to change direction. And the moment at which Boris essentially left number 10 was a great opportunity for Liz to reset, because Rishi at that time was very much seen as the kind of chancellor of Boris. And that created an opening for her to distinguish herself from Boris and also from Rishi at the same time. She was described as being somewhat socially awkward and all the rest of it. And I think that that was something that gave her actual strength. I mean, she's someone who's very good at bashing through regardless.
I get things done in government, and I don't just talk, I act.
She had a clear, unambiguous, unequivocal position on taxes. She thought we couldn't just keep taxing and spending. That was the key part of her agenda, was that she thought we needed to kickstart growth and we needed to get it going, and I was 100% behind that.
But what I am not advocating is raising taxes at this vital time when we're trying to attract investment.
Her big promise to cut taxes dramatically, to put cash back in people's pockets, and to chuck out what she branded Treasury orthodoxy.
I give notice that Liz Truss is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. Liz, come up on stage.
The Tory party faithful loved it, choosing her over Rishi Sunak.
She was a prominent part of the Free Enterprise group of MPs. She was thinking about policy more than your average MP right from the start, and came in with very strong opinions of her own to Downing Street. I think there's some who come in and they are, creatures of events or, the latest conversation they've had with an advisor. That's not Liz Truss.
From Theresa May's attempt to balance her government evenly between Leavers and Remainers, to Boris Johnson's Brexiteer convictions, Liz Truss chose only a narrow tribe. Buccaneering at first, but fundamentally fragile.
Only her side had won. Those who hadn't backed Liz were made to feel isolated, made to feel that they were not really there, they weren't given ministerial roles, there was no effort to bring people in. And you had a very bullish support base for Liz Truss, who believed that they finally got this kind of right-wing darling, low-tax conservative.
I am determined to deliver. Thank you.
It was really surprising that when Liz Truss formed her cabinet, everybody who had supported Rishi Sunak, including very able ministers, was completely excluded. That did not bode well.
Liz Truss was in a hurry. Her mission on fast forward, chucking out not just colleagues who didn't agree with her, but to tear up the status quo, that orthodoxy, the way Conservative governments that she had been part of had done business for years. And shaking up the Treasury was top of her list. Immediately sacking its top official, Tom Scholar, losing his years of experience and reputation for handling crises. Just at the moment she was embarking on drastic change and spooking Whitehall.
When it comes to Tom Scholar, he had become the embodiment, if you like, of the Treasury orthodoxy as perceived. There is a fundamental sort of Thatcherite article of faith that lowering taxes leads to more buoyant growth, which the Treasury didn't necessarily subscribe to.
Liz Truss wasn't the first Prime Minister to talk about Treasury orthodoxy. There's always been this feeling that the Treasury is very, very powerful in the UK. It made sure that its view prevailed. We wanted to set a new direction. And I think in order to establish the fact that it was a new approach, it made sense to move him on.
You're firing the permanent secretary of the Treasury, Tom Scholar, who worked for me as Chancellor and was a first-class permanent secretary, one of the best that I've had the pleasure to work with within government. I've had a number of permanent secretaries. I couldn't really understand the reason that decision was made. And if you are really going to fire a civil servant, do it sort of properly, take your time and manage it and manage the process. You treat the person with respect.
Was sacking Tom Scholar a mistake, though?
Yes, of course. Sacking civil servants because you think you've been slighted by them or they're going to disagree with you on policy is always a mistake. I don't think he probably agreed with all of my views, but ultimately he would have carried out the government's agenda, or if he felt unable to, he would have resigned. But sacking civil servants is a very, very bad habit to get into.
Because she was such an ideologue, and proudly so, I think she'd have viewed, if I'm Prime Minister and I'm not able to do what I want, why am I still Prime Minister then?
With the Treasury's top civil servant out of the picture, Truss and Kwarteng turned to their plans for huge tax cuts, the mini-budget.
This is BBC News.
Then, tragedy.
Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Almost the entire country ground to a halt.
How many countries change head of government, head of state, within a week when you haven't had a coup?
So you got a new Prime Minister on the 6th of September. We essentially were in a period of national mourning till the Monday, which must have been the 19th, and then the mini-budget lands on the 23rd. It was all done at very quick speed. A normal budget would take at least 3 or 4 months, if not 6 months, to consult over and to mull over.
It's routine, for the government to get the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, to give an assessment on how any plans for the economy will affect everything else. It usually takes 10 weeks, but Liz Truss did not want to wait. For the first time in its history, the OBR was brushed aside. This new, almost rebel government wouldn't let anything stand in its way.
What is it about her that propelled her to do something like, not to talk to the OBR, absolutely putting the pedal all the way to the floor and going at 100 miles an hour?
I think she argues that when you have things like the OBR coming in, that sort of takes more time, it delays things. I think that's why she'd have instinctively tried to sideline them in order to get these things done.
It's not a completely irrational thing to think that you only had 2 years left to the next election and you wanted your policies to bed in quickly enough so that people could get the benefit of them. And in order to do that, you had to get things done very quickly.
So the Chancellor went ahead, announcing the biggest tax cuts in 50 years.
But I'm not going to cut the additional rate of tax today, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to abolish it altogether.
What was missing? How they'd be paid for.
And I commend it to the House.
What was it like for you watching what happened when Liz Truss took over?
It was worse than just watching. Kwasi Kwarteng was my PPS. He was involved in some of our innermost discussions, and I would have said a person who had a good handle on what was needed to manage the economy. So I was really surprised that he allowed himself to be persuaded by the fantasies around the Truss economics agenda. Liz Truss had also been my chief secretary. She's an intelligent person, and some of her analysis of some of the problems in our economy is actually, in my view, not wrong. The problem was she came to the wrong conclusions about the course of action that was necessary to solve those problems. You do not start by slashing taxes.
It was deeply strange seeing the Conservatives risk sabotaging what's normally number one on their list, their reputation for managing the economy with competence and with care. Yet Liz Truss seemed to relish the idea of being a kind of rebel prime minister. Maybe some of her arguments did have merit, but the way that she brought in her measures sent the establishment into shock, and within days, she and the pound were fighting to survive.
If you're going to have the budget, you've got to do it properly. You've got to take people with you, especially you've got to take the markets with you, and you've got to show that all your decisions that you're about to announce in your budget all fit together. And that's why the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, is so important. So when you take those things together, you find the Permanent Secretary, sideline the OBR, the response was entirely predictable.
When he was the governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King said that the role of central banks was to make central banking as boring as dentistry, and we haven't succeeded in that in the past few years. The so-called mini-budget happened about midday, and the most immediate reaction in financial markets was that the value of sterling fell quite sharply. Against the dollar, sterling fell by about 4%.
But even at that frozen price, it will still be difficult for many people. And Chancellor, in the hours after your statement, we saw the pound fall to its lowest level in many, many years. The stock markets fell, and crucially, the cost of government borrowing went up too.
I think it's probably fair to say that when you put your plans at the mercy of financial markets to form their own views about what you're going to do, you rarely get the benefit of the doubt.
And also, we're bringing forward the cut in the basic rate, and there's more to come. We've only been here 19 days.
And there were comments from the Chancellor over the weekend that made market participants think, well, maybe there's more to come.
What happens if the pound continues to slide like that?
So what you know is that as Chancellor of the Exchequer, I don't comment on market movements.
On the Sunday night, as the Asian markets opened, it was clear that sterling was again falling.
I was looking at it as a global issue because the yen was at a 50-year low. So I was seeing it in terms of the dollar universally is very strong. But of course, obviously people here, rightly, were looking at the pound.
Chancellor, what are you going to do about the turmoil on the markets this morning, sir?
long-term interest rates rose by more than they did in any year of this century, other than the period around the COVID lockdown.
Do you have anything to say about what's going on, sir?
People were frankly shouting down the phone about the pressure and the stress that they were under.
What do you have to say about everything that's been going on, sir?
Just get to my office now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I realised then that that was probably something that would be a big problem for us. I mean, I myself was affected in the sense that I had to renegotiate a mortgage at the end of last year, so I was directly, in a way, caught up personally in what was going on. I said to her, we can't go helter-skelter, we've got to slow things down. We've got to slow things down. And she said to me, I've only got 2 years. And I said, you'll have 2 months if you carry on like this. I think there is some wisdom in trying to take things in a more measured way. I mean, we all know the Aesop fable, the tortoise and the hare, and it's not the hare that wins.
But there was no way Liz Truss was going to give up on her shot. She pushed on with the plan to scrap the 45p top rate of tax to be flaunted at the party conference.
I was working with her on a draft for the leadership speech that was, absolutely Liz unleashed. She was going to do the strongest, punchiest arguments yet. I'm not prepared to keep that 45p top tax rate in place for the sake of virtue signalling. I think the attitude at that time, initially, was we had to hold our nerve and that we would look weak if we were then to U-turn.
But as the conference began, could she really keep going?
The party was quite split. There were some people who thought we should stick to it, and there were others who said, well, you've got to reverse it.
That Sunday morning, in a surreal encounter, she seemed determined to plough on regardless.
There's been a lot of controversy around that decision. Are you absolutely committed to abolishing the 45p tax rate for the wealthiest people in the country?
Yes. It is part of an overall package of making our tax system simpler and lower.
But after this extraordinary blast from Michael Gove, I wasn't sure that determination would last the night.
To have as your principal decision the headline tax move, cutting tax for the wealthiest, that is a display of the wrong values.
It sounds right now, if things carry on as they are, you won't be able to vote for these measures as a Conservative MP.
I don't believe it's right.
I was essentially sent out to reverse it, and I was happy to do that. But you've got to explain what it is you're doing. You've got to explain why you're taking the steps you are.
The top rate of tax has got...
What was clear, talking to lots of people up and down the country, talking to MPs, talking to voters, talking to our constituents, was that the 45p rate was becoming a huge distraction.
The decision to U-turn on the top rate of tax was, for me, the moment where I realised just how grave the problem really was with Conservative MPs who had frankly not accepted the decision of the membership to put Liz in place as party leader. There was a real crisis of authority within the Conservative Party.
Losing a plan is one thing, losing authority another. Perhaps the answer was to lose her Chancellor.
It sticks very much in my mind. I was in Washington, and I remember speaking 2 or 3 times to the Prime Minister. She was insistent that I came back a day early. And I didn't see the point of that. We were simply just turning a drama into a crisis. Because, hauling back a Chancellor of the Exchequer in Washington can mean only one thing.
Over there and under pressure, but the Chancellor holds the line during his trip to Washington.
And you'll be Chancellor and Liz Truss will be Prime Minister this time next month?
Absolutely, 100%. I'm not going anywhere.
OK, let's just take you live to Heathrow. This is the plane carrying the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, we understand, who cut short his meeting because of the urgent economic situation here in the UK.
I was being driven from Heathrow to Downing Street. And I was in the car with my special advisor, and she was on Twitter. And Steve Swinford of the Times said the Chancellor will be sacked or has been sacked. There was a tweet. And I remember her saying, do you think this is true? And I said, if it's Steve Swinford, it's coming from number 10. This is definitely happening. Almost in the way President Trump used to operate. I was sacked on Twitter. I was pretty composed. went to see the Prime Minister, who then said she was sacking me. And I remember very clearly, I said, this isn't going to save you. This has actually made things worse for you. And I was very specific. I said, I think you've got 3 weeks now.
Do you feel like you've been betrayed by the Prime Minister?
Hello, thank you. I don't think there's any such thing really as betrayal in politics. I mean, that makes it sound too grand. I felt a bit let down. I thought if we'd held the line, we could have survived. Now, I'm not saying we would have done.
Liz Truss might have hoped sacking her closest ally would halt the relentless market turmoil and stave off a mutiny in her own party.
By then, your party discipline had just started breaking down. It's that the whole thing was just managed so badly.
A government only weeks old was already past its sell-by date.
The whole Operation Number 10 by then had utterly broken down, and they'd pretty much just sort of lost control. There was just so much concern about the Truss administration and so many mistakes that were being made on a daily basis. I think it was just then became the catalyst for ultimately what was her downfall.
Liz Truss never really seemed like she was in charge. She'd been humiliated by the financial markets, forced to ditch many of her plans. But then it came to that most basic question for any Prime Minister. Can they keep control in here, in the Commons, where they have to get things done? Remember, she'd inherited Boris Johnson's huge majority, but it wasn't hers, and she'd only given jobs to people who agreed with her. She never had the whole Tory party on board. And when it came to a vote on fracking, suddenly, it was like the mess and panic in here of Theresa May's Brexit days was back, when every day the government feared losing complete control.
The Truss fracking vote management was the exact example of why she did everything wrong.
What happened on that night, it was just like, oh, nightmare.
Labour grabbed the opportunity to expose the chaos in the Truss administration, wording a vote on fracking, which many Tory MPs staunchly opposed, so they could seize control of Parliament.
This was Labour doing party politics very well. If they won the vote, they would have control over Parliament. Now, we as Conservatives cannot give the Labour Party control over Parliament. That would allow them to pass votes, to bring new issues. Liz had to make sure she won the vote.
It was really, really serious. And so that's why that vote became a vote of confidence in the government, which was why we had to win it. It wasn't purely about fracking.
Minister Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
It was what we call a three-line whip here, so everyone was expected to vote. I whipped during the Brexit years. You know, I can remember what it was like to lose votes. I remember the pressure.
That the Right Honourable Gentleman for Doncaster North, who is an extremely clever man, for whom I have a great deal of respect, has been a little bit too clever by half.
But because at the last minute, the fracking vote was changed from the dispatch box to say it's not a vote of confidence, it was just mayhem.
Because quite clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not a confidence vote, but it is an attempt by Her Majesty's. It is.
Look down around the desk and there's all chaos and shouting and this sort of, carry on. So, blimey.
You have Conservative MPs going into the lobby they've been asked to go to by the whips, but some refusing to in the middle. And on the other side, you saw Labour MPs goading people, shouting, have a conscience, do the right thing, you should be ashamed of yourselves. So it was the worst possible situation that you could have seen. There were tears, there were people upset. You then see the Chief Whip come into the lobby. Liz Truss is in the corner having a conversation with Wendy.
I said, that's it, I resign. But then my resignation was not accepted.
Wendy walks off, Liz calls after her. Liz then runs through the voting lobby so fast that she forgets to vote. Colleagues were shouting and swearing, saying, what is going on? Because this had become such a big moment.
There's a young colleague in front of me crying. She explains that there's been some unhappiness in the division lobbies. One of her colleagues is very upset, and at that point, I lose my patience with this whole nonsense and say, right, we'll sort this out.
It is a pitiful reflection on the Conservative Parliamentary Party at every level.
Then I found a BBC camera and said, this government has run out of time.
Do you think there's any coming back from this?
I don't think so. But I haven't. I have to say I've been of that view really since two weeks ago.
I hope all those people that put Liz Truss in number 10, I hope it was worth it. I hope it was worth it for the ministerial red box. I hope it was worth it
to sit round the cabinet table, because the damage they have done to our party is extraordinary.
I've had enough. I've had enough of talentless people putting their tick in the right box, not because it's in the national interest.
I mean, look, Charles is a great man, and a very interesting man, and a very good chairman of the procedure committee when I was on it. But I'm not beginning to pretend that that particular evening was a high spot in the fortunes of the Conservative Party.
Were you in Parliament the night of the fracking vote, do you remember?
Oh, my giddy aunt, yeah. That was a bad night. You know, the standards of behaviour in Westminster and how it conducts its business has just deteriorated since 2016. And the rancour, the animosity, the just general unpleasantness.
I saw members being physically manhandled into another lobby and being bullied.
While crying.
If we want to stand up against bullying in this House of our staff, we have to stop bullying in this chamber as well, don't we?
I think some particularly silly fellow said that you can manhandle people without touching them. And I was accused of that. Well, I didn't manhandle, even in the non-touching sense of manhandling anybody. No, no.
The honourable gentleman cares to bring evidence.
That came from a very silly fellow.
Voted in the division just now without any clarity as to what it was they were actually voting for.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his point.
The headlines this morning: the pressure on Liz Truss has intensified after chaotic scenes during a Commons vote last night. We'll be speaking to a cabinet minister.
She'd won the vote, but lost the argument. MPs were in chaos, grudges, and disbelief at how the Prime Minister had behaved.
I was receiving a lot of messages the next morning and calls from colleagues who just thought that things couldn't go on. And I just picked up my phone to call number 10 to ask to see the Prime Minister when a message came through saying the Prime Minister would like to see you. And she asked me, did I think it was retrievable? And I said no. She responded to say that she didn't think it was either.
I think at the end, when she chucked in the towel, I didn't detect much fight. I think she was more literally resigned to her fate at that moment.
Given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party. Thank you.
It's really definitely tragic. What happened in those 45 days will overshadow everything she had done beforehand. Understandably, people will fixate on what happened at the end, the culmination of her career and the decisions she took each week in number 10. She had so much ambition and ideas and vision to really execute and deliver. But then for the Premiership to then be this sort of pub quiz answer now, being the shortest living Prime Minister, it really just rams home that tragedy.
Were you surprised at how messy it got so quickly?
No, they were never going to let Liz Truss stay in power.
Who's they?
The people who removed Boris Johnson.
After the surreal pantomime in here, after only 45 days in the job, Liz Truss was out. Her attempt to change the Conservatives' course had smashed into reality. Many of her MP colleagues in here had never believed she was up to the job. She'd been the party members' choice. But her time in office was so ridiculously short. How could we ever be so sure? Looking back, what we do know, perhaps,
is that her messy few weeks were the peak, the product maybe, of 6 years of chaos, when so often the Tories turned in on themselves and turned viciously on each other, while the country, the rest of us, could only watch on.
How would you sum up or describe in one phrase or one word what happened in this country, in Westminster and politics and everywhere between 2016 and 2022?
One word.
Unprecedented.
Turbulent.
Can I have three?
You
or
can
four?
have three. Or
maybe,
four.
I don't know.
You can have the phrase.
I think we lost our minds.
It is the end of normal. We're in a period of greater disruption, where people are struggling with longer established ideas.
But the key with prime ministers that were out of sympathy with the country, that were going too far, the key is the British system was able to deal with them. And in very short order, dispatched two people who it deemed were not up to the job of prime minister. So the British system, in the end, worked.
It was just messy getting there.
It was messy getting there, yes.
I think what's been damaged the most in recent years is the principle of integrity. I think we have an issue of trust in politics, sort of full stop, but it's not just a Tory party issue. Looking ahead, I think the party can absolutely recover from this, and the first step to recovery is having the right leader.
At one stage we had Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, and now we have Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, much more kind of centrist, less populist figures. People they're less excited by, but they feel more comfortable with.
Solid political institutions, continuity, cautiousness, even boringness. All of that looked as though it was gone.
In all this time, the Conservatives have hit amazing highs and devastating lows. They took us out of the European Union, making the biggest constitutional change in decades happen, but had to grapple too with the horrors of the pandemic. Boris Johnson won that incredible majority with all the authority and untold opportunity that should bring. Politicians persuade us to give them power to change everybody's lives. That's what this place is meant to be all about. But that invisible contract has been stretched, torn forever in the eyes of some, by scandals and mistakes, clashes and conflicts, hammering the reputation of this place and battering some of our institutions, and claiming the careers of 4 Conservative prime ministers. And at the end of it all, the party, perhaps the country, feels exhausted by the drama, sick of the adrenaline, but unsure, wondering where the method was in all that madness. If you hadn't seen it with your own eyes, you might not believe it happened at all.